Last night, CNN held its first town hall of this new 2020 election, upcoming election, with Bernie Sanders. Now, there were a lot of great questions asked during this town hall. They were not all easy questions. As you can imagine, Bernie Sanders usually gets tougher questions than other candidates. So we did coverage of the town hall, live coverage. We did coverage for our post game, our members, and we made note of how difficult some of these questions were, but Bernie Sanders handled it pretty well considering. Now, with that said, it appears that CNN did not disclose the true identities of the individuals asking the questions. Now, I want to be clear about something. This is not an attack on people who asked questions. This is about the unethical behavior at CNN. Viewers should know who these individuals are, where do they work? It gives the audience an idea of where this person's perspective is coming from as they're asking the question.
Now, before we go to the specific examples of the questions and who they actually are, I just want to be clear on a couple of fronts. We don't know that if these people disclose their identity from CNN or CNN chose to disclose their identity from the audience, and that is a very important question. Now, keep in mind, it's not like CNN hasn't done this before.
Right.
When Donna Bissell was working at CNN, she leaked questions about a debate during the primaries to Hillary Clinton and her team and against Bernie Sanders. So the unfortunate history here of CNN being unethical when it comes to one particular candidate, and that is again Bernie Sanders. So you guys will get to judge for yourselves, what you thought of the questions. The other clarification I want to make, and Anna's right, as we covered it live, we said, hey, look, that was a tough question, and sometimes that was an easy question. And sometimes it was a good answer, sometimes it wasn't a great answer. We had a long discussion about whether his answer on reparations was a good one or not.
Right.
And so some of that was when we were doing the play-by-play, and some of it was in our analysis for our members, tyt.com/join to become a member and get all that analysis. And we've got it all for you so you can see it with your own eyes as we covered it live on the spot. But what would have been relevant to know is who's asking the questions.
That's right.
And of course, that leads to the question of why they were asking those questions.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to, look, this is an important part of my commentary. I don't want anyone watching the show who happens to be a Bernie Sanders supporter looking up any of these people and harassing them. They asked perfectly fine questions, and they're not out to get Bernie Sanders, okay? They're not the bad guys, but the fact that their identities weren't disclosed by CNN is a problem. Now, with that said, let's go to the various people who asked these questions. So one of the individuals who asked a tough question was a young woman by the name of SHADI NASAB. Now, she was identified in the lower third of the town hall, saying that she's a student, right? But it turns out that she's an intern at a lobbyist firm known as Cassidy and Associates.
Okay, so do we know that somebody Cassidy and Associates told her to ask that question? No, we don't know that, okay? Do we know that CNN knew that she was gonna ask that? Well, they knew that she was gonna ask that question because they curate the questions, right?
Right.
But with the intent to do Bernie Sanders damage, no, we don't know their intent, okay? But is it at a bare minimum relevant that she happens to be interning at a lobbying firm in DC? Bernie Sanders' agenda would obviously not help lobbying firms in DC.
Right.
So there's a whole range of options as to how that question got onto the stage in the first place, but there is no question that CNN should have revealed her other attribute, right?
Right.
It's not that she's not a student, she is, but she also happens to work at a lobbying firm, which is very, very relevant if you're asking Bernie Sanders questions.
So let's actually go to video of her question, and you can see what I mean when I mentioned that some of these questions were difficult, and that's okay, but take a look.
So we have a question from SHADI NASAB, a student at American University. SHADI's from Denver.
As we saw in the 2018 midterms, the Democratic Party has become more female, more racially diverse, and younger in age. How can a voter like me feel confident in your ability to represent the party, especially given that your response to sexual harassment allegations during your campaign is that you were, quote, a little bit busy running around the country trying to make the case to be elected as president.
Well, I think that quote was a little bit out of context, but let me ask you a question.
So the quote was out of context, and that is the #1 talking point used against Bernie Sanders. Now, some of you will say that's too large a coincidence that the person working at the lobbying firm or interning at the lobbying firm happens to ask the one that is the #1 talking point against Bernie Sanders, framed in exactly the way that an opponent would ask that question, right? But you guys don't know whether they asked her to ask that. She might have genuinely thought that. Here, I'll give you another reason why. She might be the type of person who works at a lobbying firm and the type of person who genuinely wants to ask Bernie Sanders that question. That might be part of the reason she's interning at a lobbying firm. Or somebody could have asked her, or none of the above. It was just a coincidence. But we gotta know, context is important. Imagine if there's pick an establishment candidate, it doesn't matter which one. Let's say Cory Booker, right? And he's doing a town hall on CNN. It turns out half the questions are asked by people that have some interest in Bernie Sanders' campaign, but CNN doesn't reveal that.
Exactly.
Oh, come on.
That's a pretty
one
big
that
problem.
would never happen, right? And two, if it did happen, it'd be a huge scandal. Whereas the rest of the media so far totally mum on this. Well, they're like, yeah, well, of course, everybody's supposed to be against Bernie Sanders. They find that to be perfectly normal.
So let's get to others, because if that was the one and only example, then this would, in my opinion, not really be a big story. But there were several other people who were identified as one thing, but it turns out their background proved to be something completely different. So let's take a look at the next video. And this was another difficult question posed to Bernie Sanders.
We have a question from CHIOMA IWUOHA. She works at a nonprofit here in Washington.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Part of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the US is the legacy of income inequality in the US. What is your position on reparations to the descendants of slaves?
So perfectly fine question. So as you can see, again, in that lower third, she was identified as an employee who works for a nonprofit. They didn't even name the nonprofit, which I think is incredibly weird. But okay, works for a nonprofit, but then you do a little research and you find out that she works for Capital Partners for Education. And their board includes some people that would disagree quite a bit with Bernie Sanders, like an employee at Bose Allen is one example. So her aunt also worked for Bill Clinton as Secretary of Labor, which I actually didn't know about until I did a little bit of digging, and then I wanted to prove that. And I found, and someone also tweeted this, a photo of her aunt shaking hands with Al Gore during Bill Clinton's administration, obviously. And you also see the young woman who asked the question in the photo as well with her aunt.
Okay, so by the way, I know Al Gore. That doesn't mean that I would be biased against Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
We're giving you the full picture here so you can make up your own mind. And so was the question unfair? Now we've said 3 or 4 times, I don't think it's unfair. In fact, we had a very large conversation about whether Bernie Sanders gave a good answer or not. But that's a second tough question from a source that is not clearly labeled. So in terms of a nonprofit, well, you could be working at a nonprofit trying to cure cancer, or you could be working at a nonprofit that is funded by the Koch brothers. So nonprofit is not nearly good enough as a title. Which nonprofit? At least it gives people the ability to look it up. You wouldn't look at that nonprofit's, the average viewer is not gonna look at the nonprofit's name and go, oh, I know they're connected to the Clintons, et cetera, et cetera. But at least it gives you some sort of transparency so people could look and say, hey, does that nonprofit even have a political agenda? And if so, what is it? But if you hide the ball and you don't let us know, then we have no ability to tell where these questions are coming from.
So let's take a look at the next video.
We have a question from Troy DANTE PRESTWOOD. He's a community leader here in Washington. Hey,
thank you, Senator, for being here. The intelligence community all agree that Russia tampered with the 2016 election and used information warfare to sow further division and mistrust among Americans. It's likely that they will interfere with the 2020 election as well. So as a candidate, how will you ensure your campaign will not be infiltrated by Russia? And secondly, as president, how will you eliminate this threat once and for all to restore confidence to our electoral process?
So again, another good question, and the person who asked that question was identified as a community organizer, but upon further research, you find out that he's actually the founder and CEO of PRESTWOOD PR. I feel like that's important, right? And so if you know that he is a PR person, a founder of a PR agency in DC, you have the ability to see who they represent. Right? Are they representing certain candidates that are running against Bernie Sanders? These are important things for the audience to know. But again, I don't know why it was completely omitted from the lower third in the town hall.
So that question does have a little bit of a twist to it, and hiding his identities, I think, even more egregious. So is it fair to ask about Russia in terms of elections? So of course, perfectly fair. And in fact, if he just left it at the first part, could have even been perceived as a softball. But he had the part about how can we know for sure that your campaign will not be infiltrated by the Russians?
Yeah, that's true.
Now wait a minute, why aren't we asking Kamala Harris that question? Now remember, another Democratic establishment talking point is, oh well, Tad Devine worked with Paul Manafort and he worked on Bernie Sanders' campaign, and some of the tweets were in favor of Trump, but some were also on the left, and I wonder if they'd help Bernie Sanders. So now all of a sudden we're having a conversation about whether Bernie Sanders' campaign is going to be infiltrated by the Russians, and we're not asking that question of any other candidate on the Democratic side. So now the guy's running a PR firm and you call him a community organizer. He might also be a community organizer, but now that's a very curious omission.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I'm the CEO of the Young Turks. And I'm also an activist. If they labeled me Cenk Uygur, progressive activist, that would be true. But it would be incomplete.
Yeah.
It would be deeply incomplete if they didn't label me as founder of Wolfpack and I asked a question about money in politics, or one of the founders of Justice Democrats and I asked a question about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. How misleading would that be?
Yeah, it's super misleading. And I'm trying to figure out, and of course, at this point, all you can really do is speculate what the intentions are with CNN. But remember, this town hall is being held in Washington, DC. And they're trying to make it seem as though all of the individuals who are involved in this town hall, including the people asking the questions, are representative of the American people. But Washington, DC is not representative of the American people. People who live in DC work in DC, they work in politics. So what I see CNN doing is kind of like, reframing it as if like, no, this is a mother of two. This is a community organizer. This is a student. But they're involved in politics. They're involved in politics. And that's incredibly important to know as they're asking questions to a political candidate.
So now there's an extra layer to that. Look, CNN and the mainstream media are always aghast when you say, we believe you are deeply biased against progressives. And a huge percentage of the country believes that. And it is based on previous actions. When Bernie Sanders comes out, almost all of the articles and anchors are deeply skeptical. There's a segment on CNN that we pointed out with Jake Tapper talking about how one of his guests is like, oh, he should go away already. Why is he doing a State of the Union response? And I can go ad nauseum on that. Washington Post has 4 different articles against Bernie Sanders in 24 hours as soon as he announces. I go on and on. So there's that allegation. Now the mainstream media goes, no way, I only care about what the Republicans say. Progressives I'll spit on all day long, and I won't do anything to ameliorate that. I won't even acknowledge it, okay? So now in that context, when CNN does a town hall for the other candidates, and it's in New Hampshire, it's in Iowa, it's in the heartland. But when Bernie Sanders, they finally give him a town hall, they happen to put it in Washington, DC, and fill the room with lobbyists and PR agents and people that work in political offices. And then they don't tell you. Come on, how could you not see that that would further perpetuate what people already believe, which is that you are biased against Bernie Sanders and progressives at large? If you can't see that, if you're CNN, you're trying really, really hard not to see it. You should at least have an answer, right? Instead of progressives, we dismiss you, we're never ever gonna cover it. Well, okay, then that confirms that you're biased against progressives. If this was a Republican, my God, we'd already be having congressional hearings about it.
100%.
And CNN would hire 3 different Trump officials to make up for it.
100%, I mean, yeah. I mean, look, the reason why if this was a story on its own, okay, and you were trying to make this very same argument right now, Cenk, I would probably roll my eyes and I would say you're making too much of this. But I've been doing that with you for a while now, and I'm done. I'm done defending CNN. I'm done giving them a pass. I'm done trying to find excuses for their unethical behavior, which eventually makes me believe that they're an illegitimate news source, and I'm gonna say it over and over again, they are not legitimate. Hiring a GOP hack, and not to get into this rant again, did it for me, okay? To have someone go from working in the Trump administration, where she pledged her loyalty to Trump just so she can work as a spokeswoman for Jeff Sessions, having her go from that and immediately transition to an editorial role, you're done. There's nothing left to defend. And then you pull this stunt, come on. All right, can we go to the next video?
Yes.
Let's take a look at the next one.
I have a question from Obina McAllister. She's active in Maryland Democratic Party activities and a mother of two.
Most countries with developed economies offer public preschool as a standard benefit to all of their 3 and 4-year-olds. America does not, as we know. Instead, low-income parents here scramble for scarce public spots, while middle-income families scrounge to pay for increasingly costly private preschool. Very few can afford the cost of quality care. If you become president, will you support efforts to offer high-quality, optional, publicly funded preschool for all Americans?
Okay, so that was one of my favorite questions. Nothing wrong with that question. It was a wonderful question that I'm glad that he answered. But in the beginning, Wolf Blitzer just very casually mentioned she's active in Democratic politics in her state. Okay, moving on. And then she's described as a mother of two, except she's the chair of the Charles County Democratic Committee. That's an important role. So why can't you just tell us that she's the chair of the Charles County Democratic Committee? That is an important thing to know.
So we give you this as an example of, it's not necessarily a plot, guys. So that's a question that is a perfectly good question that's based on policy, but also could be perceived as helping Bernie Sanders because he's obviously going to be in favor of that program. So it's not a program that he's necessarily championed. Elizabeth Warren has done more to champion that cause, if you ask me. But it doesn't hurt him at all to ask that. It's not framed from a Democratic establishment talking point. So some of the people who were not correctly labeled are asked perfectly normal questions that are not framed in any negative way. We want to give you the full context because we actually care about the facts. And so, and mother of two. Yes, she's a mother of two. Again, that would be like labeling me a father of two.
No.
Well, that's true, but I also have many other roles that are much more relevant in that context, okay? And again, I show you that because it's not necessarily bad intent, because why bother hiding her identity if she's gonna ask a perfectly or relatively simple question to Bernie Sanders?
Right. And look, I think that it's okay to also add, maybe do 2 different chyrons and switch them out, which we oftentimes do, where you do note that she's a mother of 2, because she's asking a question that's very relevant to someone who happens to be a mother of 2.
That's also fair.
Yeah, so I get that.
And I want to clarify one last time. We don't mind tough questions. We mind when it's disparate treatment of different candidates. You want to ask really tough questions of all the candidates? I would love that. Including Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren? Yes, definitely including them. But if you're having disparate treatment and unclear intent, well, that's where we get into dicey waters.
And one more video for you. As you can see, this happened quite a bit during the town hall. Let's watch the last one.
Tara Ebersole, a former biology professor from Baltimore County, Maryland. Tara, go ahead.
Good evening. There's a lot of misinformation regarding your plan for universal health care. Would you please provide a brief overview of your plan and how it differs from that of other candidates?
So in my personal opinion, this was the moment where Bernie Sanders really did shine. And I thought that was a great question. It was a great way of allowing him to finally defend himself very publicly and explain how this would all be paid for. But look, she was described simply as a former biology teacher. But at no point was it ever disclosed that she's the chair of the Baltimore Democratic Party.
No, and in this case, the framing of the question was in favor of Bernie Sanders.
Right.
Because she said there's been a lot of misinformation about your universal health care plan. But again, knowing that she's the chair of a Democratic Party somewhere would also be relevant because she might have supported Bernie Sanders in the past. Now, that's not to say she shouldn't get to ask a question. In every town hall, there are people who support the candidate and who don't support the candidate. We're just asking for more honest labeling, right?
Exactly.
And for the people who are going to go further than us in accusing CNN, mainstream media, et cetera, if it was a grand plot to just undermine Bernie Sanders and coordinated with the lobbyists, et cetera, why allow people to ask questions that are framed in favor of Bernie Sanders? So it's more complicated than that, and it's not just a black and white issue. And oftentimes that's what different camps in the country want to reduce it to. But in this case, there are clear things that went wrong, and CNN should address it. But if history is any guide, they will not. They will ignore all Bernie Sanders supporters. They will ignore all progressives and not do anything about it.
I mean, we're living in a time where the public's trust in the media, and especially the mainstream media, is at an all-time low. And so now more than ever, it's so important for news organizations to clean up their act, right? Understand that, hey, maybe we need to revisit our training in journalistic ethics. I mean, it might be difficult for CNN to do that considering how many political hacks they've been hiring recently. I mean, how would political hacks know anything about journalistic ethics? They have no journalistic experience or training, like Sarah Uygur, for instance. But nonetheless, I mean, if your remedy to these very fair criticisms is to just hire people who used to work for Trump's administration, so hopefully Trump will lay low and stop attacking you, it's a really bad strategy because you still have to deal with us. Maybe you didn't have to deal with progressives back in the day. Maybe progressives were polite and civil, but I'm done. I'm done being polite and civil. I'm done with them doing this over and over again while progressives sit back and let it happen.
And we're not asking to do anything crazy. We're just asking for a clarification and an obvious mea culpa. But again, maybe they do because we don't know. We can't predict the future. But generally speaking, CNN and the mainstream media has never cared what progressives think. One last time, if it was a Republican that was in a similar situation, CNN would be groveling as we speak. Oh my God, if they had done it to Hillary Clinton. I mean, what percentage of CNN anchors voted for Hillary Clinton? We don't know. But I think you've got a pretty good guess as to what percentage, especially in a situation like that. What percentage of CNN executives voted for Hillary Clinton? Especially in a situation like that, you might want to be over the top in being clear, in labeling things, and being fair to all the candidates instead of doing what appears to be the exact opposite. The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.